Okay, welcome to the last lecture I'm giving in the course on political ideas. I will carry on with Nietzsche, and then I'll give a broad overview of the 20th century, but I will then mainly, most of that lecture will be looking at especially the post-structuralists coming out of France. I'll make some very general observations about them and then run through pretty quickly some of the key contributions. The reason I did that is because they have become extremely fashionable, and in certain subject areas, English literature, to some areas of political philosophy, some areas of philosophy, consensuses have formed which would indicate that if you just learn what they're teaching, you'll know everything important. And I think this is a terrible, terrible mistake, because I think they're very limited in what they know and what they care about, and ultimately what they contribute to seeing what the problems of the world are. Unfortunately, I do believe that my generation, those slightly older and the generation below that, have been too ready to make ideological commitments that have not been very well thought through at all. And the value of a course like this is it gives you a much vaster array, both of the historical conditions to which the major philosophical, sometimes theological responses to circumstances help enable you to see their value, but also how they specifically relate to the issues of the day. And hopefully you can think about whether those issues still have weight, even though times have changed. So whether they, in some way, whether, for example, the comparative method of Aristotle, whether or not that still has value as a way of thinking about regimes and politics. I certainly think Aristotle on politics is really one of the great contributors, but I also think so is Montesquieu, and in different ways and to different extents, Locke and Hobbes. In fact, pretty well everyone we've looked at. But as you also know, I spent a lot of time talking about the culture of the West, and that has really undergone a change, and that's also something that I will address in the latter part of this lecture. I also do want to say, as this will be the last year I think I'm giving the lecture, certainly I'm leaving CDU as a full-time lecturer at the end of this year. I just want to say I hope you've enjoyed the course. I hope you keep reading. I hope you realize how much there is to know and how little that we all know, how big the problems are, how vast the undertaking is to really seriously understand the world in which we live, as opposed to learning in something in your first year at university or second year of university and attaching yourself to an ideology and thinks that's all you need to know. That, I think, has done great damage to our public culture. And in fact, I think when I leave the university, and now I leave somewhat sadly, thinking that the university has largely contributed to the problems that we confront and a kind of dumbing down. In many ways, one of the reasons I like Nietzsche very much, there's lots of things about Nietzsche I really don't like at all, that I think are arrogant and immature and silly, and all this stuff about the Superman, which I'll start talking about, I think falls into that camp. In that way, I think it's great misfortune that both Marx and Nietzsche have towered so far over the 20th century, because both of their key ideas are just so riddled with problems. In fact, to me, they look like nothing more than blood rushes to the head. You know, young people solving the world's problem with the word, and then not addressing all the complex components of society, which you need to understand, and then oversimplifying it by basically dividing it into two groups. In the case of Nietzsche, it's the higher person, the Superman type, and the herd. In the case of Marx, it's the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. I think this is a very unfortunate legacy which spills over into our contemporary public narrative, in which race and gender and identity play such an overwhelming role in how people are thinking about things, and what is missed in that, especially geopolitically, culturally, historically, what is missed in that approach is just overwhelming. It's so vast. I think it's really a great pity. So in a sense, I feel like apologizing for my generation. Okay. So as I said, I hope you roll up your sleeves and realize how much there is to know, and don't take the path of the know-all, take a more humble path. That's my one advice I'll leave you with as will be leaving the university. Okay, back to Nietzsche. I went through some of the key points that Nietzsche was making. Now, I will repeat something that I'm sure I said last week, and it was very commonplace in the United States to take the writings of a man called Walter Kaufmann, who did translations of Friedrich Nietzsche, as if they were the authoritative rendering of Nietzsche. And as I said last week, it's riddled with problems, because basically he ignores lots of stuff, and even when it's on the page, he will put a footnote saying Nietzsche's not saying what he's saying. I think I told you I did my master's thesis on Nietzsche and Plato, and I was absolutely shocked by what I thought was the poor performance of Kaufmann. But even though Kaufmann may not be cited as much now as he used to be, he certainly left his legacy upon a lot of North American writers on Nietzsche. In fact, I would say that by and large, 99% of books written on Nietzsche are either by those that see Nietzsche as a kind of existentialist and or a post-structuralist. So they come from the French tradition or ultimately Kaufmann's tradition. Let me just put you straight on that. And sorry to be blunt, but I don't think this is simply a matter of interpretation. I think this is, to me, it's like saying 2 and 2 is 103. When Nietzsche is defanged, so to speak. If you know what you're doing, if you know that you're going to take this bit of Nietzsche but not that bit, that's fine. In fact, that's how I use Nietzsche. I take this bit and not that bit. I don't want to take it all. I think there's too much that's not worth taking. In my own work, I'm talking about. But if you're saying this is what Nietzsche really is, and then you make him out to be someone who's just writing for the individual. So the whole project, this is Kaufmann's project, is essentially an individualist project, or in the case of the post-structuralists, it's essentially a project that would build the world towards more egalitarian and just society in the way that comes out of the 1960s, which we shall look at, but which really building upon, deviating in some ways, but owes a lot to Marx. Both of these, I think, utterly misrepresent what Nietzsche is doing. And they do so because they're just ignoring all these passages where Nietzsche makes it very clear that this is a breeding project. That's the term he used. That's why you see the word physiology over and over again in Nietzsche. He believes he is able to discern whether a will to power of a person is working towards the cause of the master or ultimately an expression of resentment and slave morality. He believes that the great question mark that faces humanity at his time is whether they will deliver themselves over to a new kind of man, this higher man, what he calls the Superman, the Übermensch in German, sometimes translated as the Overman. It doesn't really matter. Übermensch is the key idea. And that this figure will give meaning to the earth. And he himself is basically a preparer of the way for this Superman. So this is not Nietzsche does not for a second believe that everybody can be simply by an act of will. In fact, Nietzsche doesn't believe in free will. It's whether you have the bodily type, to put it bluntly, which raises questions given how sickly Nietzsche personally was. Just as Marx wasn't a proletarian but speaks on their behalf, Nietzsche is not a healthy guy but speaks on behalf of the healthy, or what he sees as the healthy. And he speaks in such a way, he wants to basically cull the weak. I've misused the word exercise there, but cut out the weak from the social body. And he's very clear on this. And he's also very clear on calling for an aristocracy. He is a radical aristocrat, but not the old style aristocrat, even though he has certain veneration for that. But insofar as they become degenerate, he sees interbreeding of classes, because he sees class as very much a physiological issue, a breeding pattern. But with Christianity and with democratization, the classes all intermingle. And so therefore these higher types, it's very 19th century, it's very eugenics. And that's also why, if you look at Nietzsche reception, and I've spent a lot of time studying the different periods of time in which Nietzsche was read and the way different reader groups respond to him, or readerships respond to him. In the first 20 years or so of the 20th century, eugenics was very, very popular. It was only with the Nazis took over that people started in the democratic countries started stepping back from that. And eugenics is the idea that you could basically cultivate a type. In fact, there were a lot of people on the left, people like the Webbs, for example, H.G. Wells, that were very sympathetic to this idea, which was really pushed by a guy called Francis Galton, who was Darwin's cousin, and Nietzsche had his works in his library, and I think was very influenced by him. So when Nietzsche is reading and writing, there's a lot in the atmosphere, not just about race, in the terms of the white race versus other races. And at times you can see that Nietzsche has been affected by that. You will recall me saying that Gobineau, I think I said that Joseph Gobineau in an earlier lecture, was one of the theorists of that position. But more pertinently, it's a general position that he holds about people basically being physiological types, and you can distinguish them. And what he's done, or what he thinks he's done, is identified the better types, the higher types. And he's argued that Christianity tracks them down, hunts them down, and basically defangs the beastly qualities which are necessary. You recall me talking about the Dionysian, the Apollonian energies, which he talks about in the Birth of Tragedy. They basically cut out the necessary vitality which is beyond good and evil. And of course Nietzsche uses, as one of his books titles, Beyond Good and Evil. So the politics being radical aristocratic, as you can understand, or as you'd see, he very anti-middle class, liberal, democratic politics. He's very anti-socialism. He's very anti anything to do with the working class movements. He's very anti the anarchists, basically all the left-wing groups. I don't know if I said this. Marx does not show any recognition of Nietzsche's work, but that's, in a sense, Nietzsche had a very small audience while Marx was still alive, and even until he went into the lunatic asylum. Nietzsche may have come across Marx's writings in the works, a very influential work upon him. There's a chapter on Marx in Friedrich Langer's History of Materialism, which Nietzsche, we know he uses that book for a number of things we can trace back to that book. So Nietzsche then, and the other thing, in the main, and I may be repeating myself, but forgive me. One of the things that Marx does that's very good, but unfortunately he messes it up, but it's very good, is he takes seriously political economy and the division of labour and therefore classes. As I said, by limiting it then to this two-model struggle of which the bad guys and the good guys will triumph and the world will all live as one, as John Lennon says. That unfortunately mars the fundamental value or the importance of recognizing the role of division of labour and how it too is in a dialectical relationship with the development of technology and the entire social shape. And that's a really important, in fact, an invaluable component of any kind of analysis of society. And in many ways, sociology, even as a discipline, is a spin-off from that insight. Nietzsche doesn't really do that. He doesn't spend any time. In fact, I recall there's basically one passage that I can think of where Nietzsche, in the Gay Science somewhere, if I recall rightly, or Human All Too Human, where Nietzsche briefly mentions the importance of technology. But in the main, and it's very clear, in the main he ignores it. So what he's cutting through is to the bodily types, the idea that Christianity is ultimately a democratizing force, and that it is also at the roots of all these modern ideological configurations in which rights and equality figure. Now, as you can see here, he says things like every elevation of the type man has hitherto been, another typing error, being the work of an aristocratic society. He looks at the Book of Manu, which was a law code, a Hindu law code, that basically justifies the caste system, and especially one of the things that Nietzsche talks about is the way in which the Book of Manu justifies the cruel treatment. The cruel treatment of the very lowest caste, the Chandala, and how he says this is what you have to do if you really want to breed a higher class. We're going to have to be like this. He also sees that what the Christianization and aftermath of Christianization has done, that is the democratization, forces of democratization and class intermingling, ultimately what this has done is prepare the way for a new tyrant of the future. And this, for Nietzsche, this is the opportunity for the higher men to take over, to then use their authority to impose the values that they have poetically conjured up. See, it's not truth. There's no truth about values. Values can't be confirmed to be true or not. So it's the opposite of someone like Immanuel Kant or any of the rights theorists, who basically, or even John Locke, who's basically saying, if you use your reason or right, you'll come to these moral ideas. Nietzsche is saying, this is nonsense. And we will see in one page, and it's a one-page summing up of Nietzsche, which I'll run through in a moment. We can see his thinking behind this. I write for a species of man that does not yet exist, for the masters of the earth. And he also says there will be wars the like of which have never been seen on earth before. Only after me will there be grand politics on earth. So this is all about addressing. In fact, one of the chapters on Beyond Good and Evil is called The Philosophers of the Future. He's speaking to the philosophers of the future. He wants to create a new man. By the way, the concept of new man would also be used on the left. And that also, especially in writings around Leninism and Maoism, you start to see this formulation, because they believe that what Marx is also doing is creating a new type. So in a way, you can see a kind of intermingling going on. So that means the strong must not yield to pity. He says this over and over again. Pity is a weakling emotion. It's exactly the kind of emotion that the resentful, the weak, the herd try and encourage, not only encourage, impregnate with the society with. And this kills the strength of the society, this kills culture. You should be able to see, if you know the least thing about National Socialism, you should be able to see why it is that although Nietzsche was not an anti-Semite, in fact his sister was an anti-Semite, and her husband, who Nietzsche loathed, was an anti-Semite, Nietzsche couldn't stand them. He couldn't stand the anti-Semites because he thought the Jews were, in the main, European Jews especially, very, very high-cultured type that could be used for this project. So he didn't share the anti-Semitism with the Nazis. He was not, so these are pretty big differences with the Nazis. He was in no way, shape or form a socialist. He was not a nationalist. So when people say Nietzsche had nothing to do with the Nazis, that part is right. The part that is wrong is the fact that many Nazis are enthusiastic over Nietzsche, and the Nazis were divided about Nietzsche, by the way. Some of their most well-known theorists really liked Nietzsche and others didn't. The reason they didn't was for the reasons I've just said. Those that really liked him because they said he broadly got the project right, but he's weak on the Jews, so he gets that all wrong. He doesn't really understand their role in things. But as far as they're concerned, the idea of a higher type, a lower type, in fact, that's the whole Nazi program. One of the things it wanted to do was make slaves of the Slavs. So it was introducing, it's not only it's anti-Semitism, but it's also introducing a hierarchical kind of society in which it defines people into two types. Those that can either be exterminated or used as slaves, the weak in Nietzsche's terms, and the strong, those that will be a subject of a new breeding pool. That's what they see in Nietzsche they like. And this is the fact. A lot of Nazi theorists loved Nietzsche. It's no use some North American person who doesn't know enough about, who hasn't read these people seriously, and I don't think knows enough history and other stuff to make these claims, to simply say, oh, because of the points I just raised, therefore they've simply misread him. No. And what we can see is that Nietzsche is the kind of figure, because he's a very glistening writer, a very good writer, that people get very enthused, and then they see themselves as having a special insight into this great genius. As I said, I think Nietzsche's pretty good on some things, but I'm too tired, I'm too old to think that there's anything good can come out of idolatry of philosophers. Okay, I've spoken about Nietzsche's hostility to Christianity. He writes a book called The Antichrist, in which it's a really polemical, hostile piece of work. He basically blames Paul for it. Jesus he's less hostile to. He basically sees Jesus as a kind of otherworldly type who's not really of this world, but Paul creates Christianity as far as Nietzsche is concerned. And he sees that one of the terrible things that Christianity has done is a symbol of the cross, is a symbol of suffering, and it's made this idea of the suffering nature of life so overwhelming that one can only repent of worldliness in order to be saved. Nietzsche thinks this is absolutely terrible. But he also sees that, well, Christianity is a story, and the ancient Greek word for story was myth, and what we need is a story to counter the Christian story. And he finds this in the doctrine of the eternal return. And he equates himself with the god Dionysus. You recall me saying Dionysus was the god of nature, tearing itself apart, god of the vine leaf, of bacchanalia, of replenishment. But it's a god caught up in the cycle, in a sense, the cycle of existence. Now, again, I would warn you to be very careful of what you read about the eternal recurrence if you look at other authors, because even as famous an author whose book on Nietzsche I think is not a good book. I think it's the worst of his works on the history of philosophy, and that is Gilles Deleuze, but it very much reflects him and his time, and I will speak about Gilles Deleuze later because he's an important post-structuralist, and he's one of those people that people just idealize. I think he's beyond any kind of criticism, basically. At least those that are right into it. I think he gets a lot wrong about Nietzsche, and he ignores all the politics of Nietzsche. He just cuts all that out. He doesn't want it, and he basically lumps Nietzsche with his politics and his way of fixing up the world, and says, you know, basically Nietzsche's just like me, and I'm just like Nietzsche. Well, he writes a work on the eternal return, and I think it just absolutely misses the point. Absolutely misses it. And in some ways, it's a far more complicated and sophisticated doctrine that Deleuze projects onto Nietzsche, but when you read Nietzsche, you don't find it there. So there's two things I want to say about the eternal return. One is, why does he want it? Why does he want this doctrine? And two, what does it mean? Well, let's look first at what it means, and then we'll see why he wants it, what he thinks he can do with it. The first thing is, it's a very simple idea. And it's basically announced in the gay science, and then we also see it in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, and it appears in other couple of places. But and in various notes, you can see that he's trying to actually figure out an argument from physics that would support it. By the way, there's Louis Blanqui, the French revolutionary, who I mentioned in an earlier lecture when I was talking about Marx. He also believed in this doctrine, and Engels considers it and seems to give it support as well. But they look at it for a very different reason to Nietzsche. Okay, so it was in the air. The doctrine, it actually goes back to the Stoics. And the doctrine is this: every moment that anyone is involved in has occurred an infinite number of times and occurs infinitely into the future. It's a completely deterministic theory. It's a theory that's not only deterministic, it's what it's basically saying is there's no way out of what you do. What you do, you've done from infinity to infinity. Whether it's drinking this cup of tea I've got, giving this lecture, or if you think, you know, Wayne's banging on again, well, I've been doing it for eternity and you've been listening for eternity, and it will always be this way. And he argues, as you can see from this passage, that just as everything in nature repeats itself down to the smallest item, the spider in the spider's web, the spinning of the web, down to the smallest item, it repeats itself from the infinite into the infinite, that this would be crushing to people that believed in an afterlife and a beyond. So he's got psychological reasons for liking it. I think it's a really silly idea, and the idea that there's basically the materialist argument he gives a finite amount of material, and eventually that will have to recycle itself. That's not an idea I don't think anyone in physics would support today, where we have multiple universes and all that kind of theorizing going on. Okay. He also says, as you look over here on the left, that your doctrine is needed, powerful enough to work as a breeding agent. Not that, breeding agent, strengthening the strong, paralyzing destruction for the world weary. You can read this. You can see what it is. I want to teach the idea that gives many the right to raise themselves. The great cultivating idea, that should be idea, not it. Okay. So what I'm saying is, the strong, when they learn that whatever they're doing will last forever, you know, the murderer in his cellar will be murdering forever. The victim will be the victim forever. The blonde beast will be the blonde beast. The great artist will be the great artist, at least in those moments which return. Of those triumphant moments are bound to occur. And those that never have moments of triumph, they will realise that their faith in abuse is rubbish, that they are destined to suffer forever, and so they will kill themselves, which means they'll kill themselves forever. To me, it's like completely crazy. I find nothing at all compelling about it, and I find books that try and turn this into a more compelling idea ultimately twist and distort it to make it look that way. There's one page in the Twilight of the Idols. That book begins with a critique of Socrates. It says the problem of Socrates and also Plato. And you'll recall me saying that for Plato, Christianity is Platonism for the people. What they have in common is this idea of another world, and that you use the other world to judge this world. And you only go to that other world because you're not capable of adequately embracing, tragically embracing this world. So this is how he puts it. The true world, unattainable for the sage, the pious, the virtuous man. He lives in it, he is it. The oldest form of the idea, relatively simple and persuasive, a circumlocution for the sentence I, Plato, and the truth. So that's, you know, that's where virtue is. Can't find it here, we'll find it elsewhere. Therefore, we invent this idea of the idea. Then he says, the true world, unattainable for now, but promised for the sage, the pious, the virtuous man, for the sinner who repents. You can see this elision of Platonism and Christianity, and progress of the idea becomes a more subtle, insidious, incomprehensible, becomes female, it becomes Christian. Now, I'll just say that this is a pretty shabby caricature of the relationship between Platonism and Christianity. And if you want to get it, just go off and read more church history. And you cannot understand pretty well the first 1,000 years of what's going on in Western Europe without having a good understanding of where Christianity features, which is why I spent so long talking about Christianity in the course. Then the true world, unattainable, indemonstrable, unpromisable, but the very thought of it a consolidation, an obligation, an imperative. Here he's saying it becomes an idea it becomes a moral idea. It's a product of reason, but reason recognizes it's beyond experience and therefore makes it the bastion of its faith. This is basically, this is a kind of summing up. It's not really wrong. In fact, it's quite a neat formulation of what Kant is doing. Okay. So at bottom, the old sun, but seen through mist and skepticism, the eyes become pale Nordic, Königsbergian. Kant lived in Königsberg. That's what he means by that. Then, the true world, unattainable at any rate, unattained, and being unattained also unknown, consequently not consoling, redeeming, or obligating. How could something unknown obligate us? Grey morning, first yawn of reason, the cockcrow of positivism. And a number of Nietzsche's early books basically show that Nietzsche himself had been very open to this doctrine of positivism. We usually associate it with Auguste Comte, and I don't want, but it's basically the idea that the only thing that is real are the facts, positive facts. But because values aren't positive facts, but they're sentiments, ideas, something that accrues over time, mythologies in Nietzsche's sense, they're all of these. That basically leads to this situation which I talked about last week, nihilism, there is no truth, and this is something that leads many to want to end it all. There's no meaning to life. He thinks this is an idea that gives people suicidal tendencies. It's a terrible world, but for him and the great creators, that photo up the top there, that's what's his name? Carl Jasper Friedrich, the great romantic German painter, the Wanderer and his The Wanderer and something, and that's Nietzsche writes a book called The Wanderer in His Shadow. That's why I'm confusing that. But this painting is often used on covers of Nietzsche. It's a sense how Nietzsche sees himself. Okay, cockroach positivism. In the true world, an idea which is no longer good for anything, not even obligating, an idea which has become useless and superfluous, a refuted idea, let's abolish it. Bright day breakfast, this is basically the pandemonium. This is the time, says Nietzsche, we have lived in. And now I, Nietzsche, the true world we have abolished. What world has remained? The apparent one, perhaps, but no, with the true world we have also abolished the apparent one. So there is no truth. It's just imposition of value. Noon, moment of the briefest shadow, end of the longest era, high point of humanity, incipit Zarathustra, which is to say, I, Nietzsche, am going to tell you who's to live, who's to die, what counts, what doesn't. I mean, the arrogance of this, as with Marx, is just overwhelming. And the lack of, again, intellectual humility is just so fast and so striking, but in a sense, consumer readership, and people bought it and still buy it. As I said, there's lots of insights in Nietzsche, but this representation of philosophy is, to put it very mildly, very simplistic. It's a kind of thing you could only write if you ignored a lot of other philosophers. And to my way of thinking, there's some philosophers that are really worth reading, which doesn't fit in this schema at all. Okay. So, basically, I said the Nazis would love him. Hitler gives Mussolini the collected works of Nietzsche as a present, you know, when Hitler and the Italian leader Mussolini. Hitler's sister rewrites some of the notes of the Will to Power. This is said by Walter Kaufmann to confirm that she had distorted his teaching. She didn't. She just basically suppressed the nasty bits he said about her. She was pretty batty, and Nietzsche thought she was a bit of an idiot, and her husband an even bigger idiot. They went off to Paraguay and started some new Germanic commune there, which basically those that remained there became all inbred and half-wits. Very sad, really. But she came and ended up overseeing the Nietzsche archives, and she welcomes Hitler. Though, to be fair to her, she was not really crazy about some of the stuff he was saying about the Jews. She thought that was going a bit too far. But you'd see it's a culture in chaos, and really bad ideas come to the surface. And there she is with Hitler. So to many fascists, Nazis, and there's other fascists like D'Annunzio, the very good writer, Ben, the National Socialist poet, great German poet, by the way, but National Socialist, really like Nietzsche. But then there's others who also like the Nazis and didn't really like Nietzsche, as I said. But Nietzsche also appealed to bohemians and artists who basically shared the vision that Nietzsche had about there being this kind of last man. And the bohemians and artists saw themselves as the antithesis of these blinking bourgeois, small-minded, narrow-minded idiots who they saw taking over the world. So they again saw themselves closer in spirit to the artists. And I've got a painting there by Franz Mack or August Mack, of the Blue Horses, which is basically an expressionist version of the strength and vitality of our animal nature and its beauty. And that kind of thing was really appealing. The intelligentsia tended to begin the process of marrying, especially in France. Again, you've got a different kind of intelligentsia in Germany in the main. There are those that are Marxist and basically flee or get caught up in the machinations of the Nazis, but most of them fled. And they obviously, Marxists gravitate to Marx, and generally, again, in France, the intelligentsia gravitates more to the left, even when they really like Nietzsche. Georges Bataille is a case in point. Georges Bataille would be an author who these guys from the 60s, I'm going to talk about later, really admired. He wrote much earlier. He was writing in the 30s. In some ways, there's lots in his stuff that looks really quite fascist, but ultimately he sides with the socialists against. At this time, in the 1930s, it was almost a flip of the coin whether you go with the fascists or with the Marxists. Most of the intelligentsia tended to go with Marx, even when, as I said, they really liked Nietzsche. And the other thing was that what they liked about Nietzsche in France, they saw Nietzsche as being the opposite of the teaching of Descartes. And they blamed Descartes for all this mechanistic view of the world, which they also equated with. And so all these art movements that come out of, and in reaction to First World War, they equate the source of the First World War with the machine age that has been made possible by the kind of mindset of instrumentality and reasoning of the sort dreamt up by Descartes. So they like Nietzsche's vitalistic, exuberant response, but they just ignore his politics, as I said. In Germany, on the other hand, in the main, as I said, it was the Nazis. They liked the fact that Nietzsche was irrational, and they saw National Socialism as a great vitalistic, irrational way out for the problem. Now, as I said, in France during the 1960s, the kind of lead up, the other thinker that they really liked in France at this time, again, Bataille, Maurice Blanchot, a lot of them liked, was the Marquis de Sade. And had we had more time, Marquis de Sade's work is based on cruelty, sexual excess, and murder of children, this carnivalesque, imaginative, orgiastic, blood-dripping, semen-filled scenarios, and the French intelligentsia really loved this. And so putting Sade, Nietzsche, and Marx all in the one box, that really became a big part of the French legacy, philosophical and literary legacy that dominates the thinking of the 1960s. It's very different to what's going on in the UK, the US. Only belatedly do they come and take on the French, and of course to Germany. And it's why also, I may have said this before, forgive me, in Germany, in the post-Cold, I did say this, but I'll just repeat it. In the post-Cold War, Second World War period in Germany, Nietzsche was very persona non grata. It was not cool to be. Okay. Now I want to leave Nietzsche. I want to just very briefly touch on some features, very thinly, philosophical features of the 20th century. And then I'll start again very briefly to talk about the youth revolt of the 1960s. And then I'll start to look at the kind of narratives, what is now anti-domination narratives. They basically all line up as being searches for total emancipation, total freedom, the end to any kind of domination, basically a belief that fascism was the incipient kernel of Western thinking. And they tend to get that idea is already appearing in Heidegger, who actually was a Nazi, a supporter, a public supporter for a short while, then a silent carrying card member, and then after the Second World War, he reframed himself as a victim of the National Socialists and told a whole lot of lies about himself. This all became exposed in the latter 1980s 80s. Actually, it was already known really in the 1960s, but more stuff came out in the 1980s. Okay, but basically, Heidegger had argued, I'm just really summing this up very succinctly, Heidegger had argued that the key of Western thought is to be based on the fact that philosophers have broken up what he calls the event of being, which is, again, I'll use other Heidegger formulation, a lighting into the world, being, with the search for beings. So they've broken it up by basically, they've broken up reality. That's the easiest way to put it. I'm just going to word the reality and being, that's crude in Heidegger, but just to give you I want you to get the core feature of his thinking. They break it up in order to have instrumental domination, a kind of technique and technology. If you can hear how a lot of greenies would end up liking Heidegger. That basically Western metaphysics, so going back to Plato. So in that, he's like Nietzsche in seeing Plato as the beginning of the problem, but he ends up being quite contrary to Nietzsche, though in his one work of his called Being and Time, which was his great early work, there's bits in it which are very Nietzsche-like, but then he walks away from that because he basically won't face up to the Nazism that he was with, and he starts saying, oh, no, I got it wrong. Nietzsche is really the last metaphysician. Nietzsche is the person that brings together this breaking up of the world into all these powers in which being and power and the will all move in this direction of domination. And the huge influence that Heidegger will have will be upon those left-wing, and they're nearly all left-wing, in fact, they're all left-wing, all the people we're going to talk about here. That is, they all in some way, shape or form line up with Marx and that project, a much more egalitarian project than the kind of hierarchical project of Nietzsche. Now, I will say this. Funnily enough, remember I keep saying that Nietzsche, Marx wasn't of the type he represented. Nietzsche wasn't of the type he represented. And this is true of Rousseau as well, what has become very clear in the sociological development of the new priestly class, that is the intelligentsia, is that through positioning themselves vis-a-vis the ideas they have, they therefore become very similar to what Nietzsche is looking for. That is, they become the deciders of the values. They shape the values. So although their project is ostensibly to work cooperatively and create this great society in which there are no powerless anymore, that everybody is empowered, everybody is emancipated. They're only empowered and emancipated if they follow their philosophy, their direction. So I think they end up, and I do think they do marry, they breed with each other. I think they end up actually being very Nietzschean in spite of their, ultimately I'd put it this way, I think there's a kind of feigning of, just as there was a feigning of the relationship from Marx to the proletariat, because he wasn't of it. I think it's exactly the same things that occurs with these new Nietzscheans. So in that way, I think their selection of bits and pieces of Nietzsche to fit the largesse of their picture, the grandeur of their picture, in which they're for everybody except, of course, those that oppose them, those that dominate, the wealthy, whites, etc., those that feast of privilege, they then become the group with the ambition who draw new privileges to themselves, the economic resources, to be able to monitor their philosophy. I think it's really weird how that ends up, an irony of history, so to speak, how that ends up being the case with them. But I'll come to them in a moment. So first of all, look, the biggest thing that everybody who knows anything about the 20th century would know is that basically it's an ideological contestation. Nationalism works its way into and through all the ideologies. So it's in a sense it's a master ideology, and it's important for the breakup of empires, the inter-imperial conflict. Remember, First World War triggered by the nationalist aspirations of those Serb terrorists. National Socialism and fascism will both intensify nationalism, but they don't own nationalism, because liberal democracies also remain nationalist. And we see, even with the socialist countries, all of them remain nationalist. Stalin openly, constantly appealing to the motherland of Russia in the Second World War. The Chinese break with the Soviets, the Yugoslavs break with the Soviets. So you can see nationalism, in a sense, wins by default. Though the European Union is the attempt to really undermine, in the aftermath of the Second World War, nationalism, because it believes nationalism, or the creators of the Union and those strongly committed to it, ultimately see that nationalism is a bad thing. It's a dangerous thing. But then there's also the ideological contestation, but that comes out of Marxism, Leninism, Stalinism, and then post-Stalinism, sometimes anti-Stalinism, but post-Stalinism, the National Socialists, and liberal democracy. And the way it appears is that the most recent of those, National Socialism, has the shortest life. Then at the end of the Cold War, communism goes. It's retained in a couple of countries, and China keeps a political form, but not the economic form, which is to say it's not really communism at all. In fact, it's got more in common with fascism, because fascism is both socialistic and nationalistic and corporatist. I don't want to go too far into it, because there's lots of socialists that, are going to rail against that idea. But in fact, there really was a push of a certain kind, National Socialism. Equality did play an important part in the Nazis. This is invariably ignored. There's one very good book on it by a Turkish German whose name escapes me at the moment. If anyone wants it, I can send it to them. Very good book that details this. And also through simply taking stuff off the Jews who, aren't part of the nation, so their stuff doesn't count. So, but obviously it's not Marxian socialism. It's played out, and then liberal democracy, but I do think this is very simplistic. I think, just as if you want to know the roots to communism and fascism and liberal democracy, certainly in its post-French revolutionary expansionist rights-based version, we would take it back to the French Revolution. Liberal democracy is a little bit more complex, but to put it this way, let me put it this way. These ideologies are all responses, group responses, ideational responses to circumstances of modernizing new elite formation. So and given that France, for example, had become basically a gigantic military power, as had the Soviet Union, it's not surprising that you'll see all sorts of fascistic components in it, because that's what the Germans wanted to do, was basically be a major military power, the world dominating power, just as Napoleon had wanted to do, or in his case the European. But ultimately you never stop with this. Okay, what none of these people saw was the resurgence of Islam, which was signaled by the Iranian Revolution. And this was the beginning of a break between what is going on in the Western world in terms of the dominance of political configurations and what's going on outside the Western world, especially in the Muslim world. But even then, if I was to go further into it, if we looked at in Africa, etc., we could see that there's also sorts of things happening that don't fit into these ideological configurations which tended to dominate the narratives and the understanding of what was going on in the 20th century. But as I said, if we look more closely, we will see that the commonalities between all these ideologies should not be overlooked, that they both display something about the modernizing sociological transformation that's part and parcel of modernization itself. Okay. Second thing I want to mention is that in the Western democracies, the expansion of capitalism and administrative statism went hand in hand. This is often called neoliberalism. And there was a resurgence of economic liberalism, and there was broadly, you could say, a critique of certain practices of the welfare state that the narrative started to emerge in the late 60s, early 70s. They basically emerged as a reaction to Keynesianism that was brought about by what's called stagflation. There was both high unemployment and high inflation, and usually that was considered a trade-off. You could basically, if you had low unemployment, you get higher inflation and vice versa. But that's the kind of standard story. And indeed, that was the story that the economists were concerned about. But politically, what was going on was something quite different. And this, again, I'm astounded by the simple rendering of what went on and the willingness of people to use that word neoliberal without really digging deeply enough in it to, I think, get a much more accurate picture of what was going on. So there was also, supply side economics, monetarism, but basically what happened was this. More and more women were going into the workforce. That meant that, but not more and more jobs were simply being created because there were more and more women going into the workforce. So this also changed the way in which family income would be generated, and it opened up opportunities of profit, because although the unions mitigated against this, not completely, they couldn't do it, workers' wages could be lowered. And very quickly, what was basically the model of social reproduction in Western democracies, which was basically a one-income family, turned into a two-income family. So this was happening. At the same time, there was a recognition that the expense of the industries that had been nationalized was a heavy expense. And there was basically a desire by owners of capital to push out state competition, but the state itself, there was also, because welfare, it had to pay out more welfare because of more unemployment. There was an incentive to sell off its industries, and in some cases, for example, coal mining in the United Kingdom. And the governments of Margaret Thatcher and in the United States, Ronald Reagan, were really the pioneers of this capital labor shift or state capital reconfiguration that went on. And that's exactly what happened. There was a reconfiguration of alignments, or a realignment. And that realignment meant, so in the case of the coal mines, I was getting to that, very expensive to keep going in terms of the infrastructure. And Thatcher wanted to close them down. The left then, unlike now, didn't see coal mines as an environmental hazard that had to be stopped. The left universally supported the coal miners in the conflict with Margaret Thatcher. And there's a great irony to think that Margaret Thatcher now could be, she's not because people don't remember, but could be seen as a kind of hero to the Green movement. The irony of that is just gobsmacking. Okay, so what is needed is to sell off all these enterprises that aren't profitable, and for the state, so on the surface that looks like the state is going to shrink, but for its part, capital is basically demanding two things. And because the state is in need of revenue, and because of higher unemployment, the state is really responsive to this. So the two things they want to do is, one, have more revenue raising opportunities, which, to put it bluntly, they want to get rid of tariffs and any kind of protection, and basically have more open markets. This is where the term neoliberal really comes in. So it's a globalizing capital flow, and then the push to, that comes later, but not much later, and it's kind of triggered also by multicultural policies, more open capital flows. So that's the one side of the neoliberal. But another trade-off occurs. And again, what happens in Thatcherite England, and it happens there more so than in the United States, is really the key to what is going on. And England will basically be followed around the world in this. And that is, capital wants to offload the skills training component of its productivity. To put it another way, it wants the state to use the universities, in Australia we call them TAFEs, but various other training schools for apprentices. It wants to lay off the apprentices. This is actually, even the desire for this was developing even prior to Thatcher, but it really gets consolidated there. So shift that burden, so therefore their pool of labour will be a much more skilled, trained, educated. And this also fits the universities, because now the universities, which have been expanding since the 1960s, now they have a mission. Now they have a justification to get revenue. So there's a whole lot of interest locking in, and as they're each locking in, you can see that one of the things that happens is the state offloads one set of expenses but takes on a new lot. This is why I find the term neoliberalism very misleading, because very often when people say this, they see the whole thing as an attack upon the welfare state instead of a reconfiguration of what constitutes state activity. And there's another group in the mix I should mention, because there's another revolution takes place. And this is the managerial revolution that takes place in the proliferation of business schools. I should have had a slide on this, but there's a proliferation of business schools. There wasn't one business school in England in the 1950s. They go back to the US. They started much earlier in the US, but there wasn't one in England. But ultimately what happens in the 1960s is they start to proliferate. And then as the Masters of Business Administration becomes an intrinsic part of university departments, you've basically got all these people with MBAs wanting to manage. At the same time, the burdens of the state now have spread in such different directions that there's going to be a need to make sure that the revenue raised by the state and put into these, into the public sector, now that also there's the business, all these people with MBAs coming and saying, look, we know how to do this efficiently, so you won't waste your money. And therefore the voters will have a better sense of what is going on and able to control you, the state, from wasting your money. Well, they don't actually, none of that's achieved, by the way. What ends up happening is that in universities, in hospitals, the police force, you name it, any area of the public sector now gravitates towards a new kind of narrative, managerial narrative, managerial practice. The student ceases to be a student and becomes a client. Hospitals are no longer run by doctors, but by administrators. In fact, administrators infiltrate the whole sector. And eventually, of course, the same will happen in the private sector as well. HR will be driven by management. So you've got, again, another aspirant for economic empowerment. The managerial class really spreads into the public and the private sector. Part of that process is very understandable, goes way back, but this is really the moment of consolidation. And the point I want to make is it comes in as exactly the same moment as the globalization agenda takes place. I don't want to lose you here. I'm going to move on. I will just say this. None of the analysts that we're going to look at, when we look at the French post-structuralists, none of them are very good on this. The only one that sort of nibbles to a very small extent that doesn't get it is Michel Foucault. I think they really missed something. And I think they really missed something that's very advantageous to them to miss it, because they failed then to see that their role and the managerial role are capable of a coalition, which we actually see in practice. We see it very much in practice through the kinds of behaviour protocols that are demanded in public corporations. And daily you see examples of this. Every day I see something about this. That if a behaviour is seen as immoral in some way, then the corporation, the management will fire that person. Management and narrative based upon ideas that come out of the post-68 generation, they all tie up together. This too explains why, again, I see very few people talk about this, but it's really important. This explains why someone can simultaneously be a lecturer and be virulently critical of capital, and yet ultimately, when push comes to shove, support a globalist economy in which finance and global capital are accelerating at an enormous growth rate, and really be indifferent to the plight of the working class, who in North America, for example, can simply just be dismissed as white trash. So this is the way in which the ideas and the practices, which is all important, and the historical moment all intertwine. Now, in fact, in a different kind of course, I would speak much longer about this, because I see this as so overwhelmingly important in the world that you're living in, and it ain't going to be explained by any of these theorists that I'm talking about. It's just, they just don't see it. They don't see their contribution to it. They're quite happy, again, you know, someone teaching literary theory is quite happy to be critical of managerialism, be critical of neoliberalism, but they absolutely fail to see the way in which what they do, and neoliberalism, as they call it, and managerialism actually coalesce. And again, you can see this, university administrators are full of people who've made a living out of selling left-wing narratives and now move into management structures. It's such an easy glide, because they're not antithetical. They are in a dialectical relationship. Remember I talked about opposites in unity being dialectic? So they're in a dialectical relationship. They feed into and off each other. Okay, I'm going to go back a bit for a moment, because I do want to spend, as I said, a fair bit of time on these anti-domination narratives, which are so ubiquitous, and which are just generally the people that teach them love these ideas, and so have no criticism to make, because they can't see anything wrong with it. And so someone like me comes along and they would be seen as, well, why is he saying this? Where did he get this from? And you must be a conservative or something. By the way, I don't consider myself a conservative or a radical. I just want you to know that. And I don't see it as my job to have an ism. But I do think it is my job to get you to think about the serious problems about tradition and their accruement and their breakdown, and the elite groups that try and create a future. And that ultimately requires thinking beyond ideology. But however, one of the myths perpetuated by the anti-domination group that comes out of Marx is the idea that all thinking must be ideological. If you're not for us, you're against us. If you're not a socialist, you're bourgeois. If you don't believe feminism 1, 2, and 3, but other feminists, other women don't believe all of that, then you're an anti-feminist. If you don't believe what we're saying about race, you're you're racist. This is thoughtlessness. This is just sheer, brute, raw, unmitigated bullying use of power by an elite that wants to secure its role as the formers of narrative and the surveillors of narratives, who can speak, who can't speak, who has a platform, who doesn't have a platform. And our universities are absolutely cursed with this. And it's one of the reasons, to be perfectly frank, when I leave, I won't be that sad to leave, because I'm deeply despondent about practices such as deplatforming, which are commonplace especially in universities and in the urban centres, globally in the West, that the deplatforming is ultimately a way of saying, not only that you can't be heard, you may not have a point, but we know the truth. We know it. And anything that doesn't fit our narrative must be silenced. This cannot end well. And that is a huge, this was not, although I can see the seeds of this sowed in the 60s, the 1960s and 70s was not like this. There were people that yah-booed, and I didn't like that either. But what had not happened was that there was a corporate capture, a corporate cultural capture. And that's what it is. It's both corporate, it's cultural, it's ideational, and it is a capturing of institutions, which ultimately occludes people to processes which may be far more dangerous than they can ever realize, far more tearing the fabric apart of society. Okay, I'm going to wind it back again because, as I said, I want to look at these post structures. I would just say that Max Weber, one of the greatest minds of the 20th century, one of the greatest scholars too, used the formulation "the iron cage" to identify what he saw as a problem facing modern humanity. And that suggests the iron cage is basically a bureaucratization of the spirit, in which all these reasons are used as instrumentalities of power, and let's use the word, and domination. A kind of domination is taking place. In the case of Weber, though, he is not specifically blaming one class for doing the dominating. He's just seeing this as a general tendency. And what he's seeing is that the modern world, he uses the phrase, it's disenchanting the world. There's a spirit of disenchantment. So it basically reduces everything to a kind of power value. Obviously, monetary is one, ideological is another one. And the idea that he expresses, this idea has become so widespread, not because of him, it's widely seen that there's a kind of death force that is occurring within modernity. And given this is a century of such deadly ideologies and conflict, given that this is a century of world wars, there'd be something wrong with our philosophers if they didn't attempt to formulate this kind of deafness that was happening in the society. So they also, very much like Nietzsche, saw this meaninglessness, this spread of meaninglessness. So this was something that they took over from Nietzsche, and also many of them took over from Marx, because many of them saw that this is because of capitalism. And philosophers, so we find this in right-wing philosophers. I mentioned Martin Heidegger. Another is the Nazi legal theorist. Well, he was a very famous legal theorist before he became a Nazi, but somewhat of an opportunist, but he did write anti-Semitic stuff. Like Heidegger, he lost his post after the war. But like Heidegger, he kept writing and he had a wide readership. Okay. Now, to understand the anti-domination taking root, so its seeds precede the youth generation. Walter Benjamin I had over the page. So there's already a wrinkle in Marxism, which was starting to look at culture as a source of domination. So we would be dominated through the cultural products and ideas in circulation, not just by the political economy, but by the political economy as well. But it's taking Marx, even though you can find bits of this in Marx too. But ultimately, though, it does something that Marx doesn't do, and that is it basically ends up jettisoning the working class, because you can't find a causal alliance with it. And this is going to be very important, because what we find in the youth revolt of the 1960s is the non-working class, the students, very often claiming to speak for the working class, at moments as in Paris in the riots of 1968, making temporary allegiances with them. And some of the Red Brigade in Italy, are basically the terrorist group, had some working class support, but ultimately it's not an alliance that lasts, because they're basically different classes. Now, Marx had muddied the waters by simplifying classes too much, as I said. And as I also said, he doesn't do that in some of his writings on the 1848 revolution and the 18th Brumaire. He doesn't do that. But he always has this tendency to do it. And the student, when I went to university, I would hear Marxist academics tell me that they were proletarian. This is laughable, because the whole point about the proletarian is they're non-skilled industrial workers. They weren't an industrial worker, and they were highly skilled. The thing about this revolution, though, this youth revolution in the 60s, it went hand in hand with a whole set of cultural transformations. In part, it was a reaction to trauma, to disbelief and horror at their parents' generation. In the case of Germany, where, again, the youth revolution was extremely important, their parents had been, and grandparents, many of them had been Nazis. Most of them had been Nazis, or had gone along with the Nazis. So you can see why they're traumatized. In France, this is less often known, but once France was taken out of the war, it was the biggest provider of troops for the Nazis of any of the other powers. So there was also a great deal of anti-Semitism in France, and many Jews got sent off to camps from France. So again, there's a preoccupation in both Germany and in France, and this comes through in the theory, with the idea that fascism has infiltrated all institutions. And then they use the kind of Heidegger story. There's some bigger story at work that is part of the Western civilization. And we could see this Western imperialism, Western colonialism. It precedes actual fascism. It's already, in a sense, fascist in nature. And fascism is the last sort of exhibit of this, the final exhibit of this, that shows us that we must overturn this. The system is rotten to the core. It's the system, man. We've got to overthrow the system. and with big, large bongs and late night conversations and etc., etc. That phrase must have been said a zillion times. In the United States, they had their own shame. They had slavery, the history of slavery. And the civil rights movement was still undoing the way in which post-slave southern states were nevertheless highly discriminatory and oppressive against blacks in the United States. There was also the history, through especially of the 19th century, of the mass slaughter and dispossession of the Indians of land, moving them into reserves. There was also the atom bomb. America had dropped that, still an argument, were they saving lives or not, or was it just to illustrate power? But basically the narrative in the 60s was that America was the biggest criminal in the world. But this showed it, and what was also showing it was the war in Vietnam, which many of the youth didn't want to go to that war. So, in the United Kingdom, there was the guilt of the Commonwealth. We had gone and we had possessed Africa, or large chunks of Africa and India. This is shameful. And the shame of empire. So all of these things were playing on the mind of a generation that was simultaneously had more opportunities, economic opportunity to play because the economies were generally very strong, to make music, to go into films. More opportunities open for them than any generation before, and I would probably say since. Massive opportunities there. And what you tended to see happen is a bifurcation between kind of artistic explosion and a political desire for transformation that then feeds out of the youth movement into these various groups that all are able to identify themselves as oppressed, beginning with the women's movement. Now, the antecedents of the women's movement, again, they go right back. But really, I would say you can find women, very interesting women writers. Christine de Pizan had a bigger course, and instead of trying to get you the essentials, especially in terms of history and text that really at that time mattered, but had I had more time and devoted myself to texts like Christine de Pizan's or those of Hildegard of Bingen, we can see there's a number of very interesting, Hypatia, the philosopher. There's a number of very interesting women writers, but they didn't radically change the society, because the radical change of the society with respect to women's social, not just economic, it really begins social role and rights. We might go to Olympe de Gouges in the French Revolution, was actually executed for coming up with the natural rights of women, or Mary Wollstonecraft, the daughter, if I recall rightly, of William Godwin, the anarchist and wife of Shelley, a writer of Frankenstein, isn't she? Anyway, I'm pretty sure I'm right in saying that. You can check that. But her vindication of the rights of women is a classic text. She's basically giving a set of Rousseauian arguments, but Rousseau wasn't supporting the rights of women, but she draws upon his arguments of rights and the will, the general will, and she comes up with that. But basically, it's the first wave of the women's movement marching for the right to vote, which they got very quickly once they become organised politically. And the reason for that is the working class that had got the vote in the United Kingdom in the 1870s could quickly see that if their wives and daughters could get the vote, that would help. That would help the family. So there's a cooperation. It wasn't just women versus men. But in the 1960s, with the women movement, primarily coming out of the United States, United Kingdom, France, West Germany, Australia, all, primarily coming out of Western countries. The narrative is about the domination of women by men. At the same time, another narrative comes out, and that comes out of the sexual liberation movement. So there's a widespread opening up of sexual mores, people living with each other. At this stage, the state, if it's people living with each other, the state doesn't have any say. It's interesting, after a generation or two of people living with each other, de facto couples end up having the same kind of divorce settlements as married people, so they might as well have been married, because the state needs its resources. And people go to law when they start to have conflict about their resources. But it's the beginning of gay liberation, of all the stuff around race, especially coming out of the civil rights movement, ethnic. And so basically there's a broader opposition to what's called Eurocentrism. That term starts to become widely used amongst anthropologists and others. It's basically seen as a white male but straight capitalist exploitation model. But you start to see each one of these can be hived off. And as these groups of identity formed around this, it's almost like a practice now in needing a greater theoretical justification, and then needing an outlet to legitimate or achieve its objectives, an institutional outlet, because in fact the alignments are actually very small. It's not all blacks become Black Panthers or Black liberationists. It's not all women become feminists. It's not all gays even become caught up in an open expression of sexuality. It's not like ethnic groups all think the same. The ethnic issue comes more into play once we get multiculturalism, and then there's a politicization of difference in such a way it's convenient for the parties to broker with some community leader. This is, of course, there is no community leader. It's all conjured up. It's a complete fabrication. There's no leader of women. There's no women's perspective. There's multiple perspectives. There's no male perspective. There's multiple perspectives. But of course, all this, once you start talking multiplicity, you start fracturing the unity that you want to achieve through solidarity. So this is solidarity not only de facto, because it is partially de facto. There's certain, of course, some people feel this and think this and align themselves, but there's other mitigating sociological forces which make, this woman is that person's daughter or sister, she has a brother, or she has a male lover if she's not gay, or whatever, or a husband, and then or a male child. You see, the way human relationships really work is that you're defined in relationship, not against. And in the main, this kind of ideological thrust was really built about a couple of things. It was primarily to garner more socio-economic power, some of it very understandable, certain professions generally blocked to women, opportunities not there. The argument was it was systemic, so you had to change the system. The problem with any systemic argument always seems to me, if it's systemic, then how can you change it through an act of the will? Then it's not systemic. It may be a common enough feature, and you may do something about it, but the danger of saying it's systemic is then you can always say, someone thinks this, someone does this, and discount the fact that they may have other reasons you haven't considered. And this is one of the more unfortunate legacies of this class of policy. Also, environmentalism. This becomes a big issue. Again, there's works that are showing damage done to the environment before the movement set up. But so basically, it's a kind of identity politics or issue-based politics. There's also a style revolution. And that style revolution is in the taste, in the what people wear. It flows over obviously into the sexual revolution, and made more possible to a generation really wanting this by the birth control bill. It's the push for widespread abortion. It takes some time, but ultimately. So again, that's a good example of for these sentiments and habits, and the people that are defining what they want in terms of a particular group, issue, or identity, whether it's justifiable or not, and you can give lots of things that you could say, yes, that's very justifiable. The point is, it's understandable these groups want it, but I'll just come back to the fact that in the main, it comes out of the students, it comes out of the elite. So these kind of alignments are inter-elite conflict, as well as the elite defining itself against the rest of society. And at this stage, when these revolutions first take place, they're basically free-floating. They're there because they can either get some job to support them, or in most cases, their parents are supporting them. But within 10, 15, 20 years, this is the new professional classes. And the whole point I tried to mention in passing, I draw this out in much more detail when I discuss the French Revolution. But the whole point of the modern elite transfer of power, of which the French Revolution is such a decisive moment for the world, as opposed to the American Revolution, more just for America because of its unique conditions. The whole point of that is, or the centerpiece of that, it's the professional classes that gain power for the first time. And the professional classes, their training ground is the university. Certainly by the 1960s. That wasn't the case in France at that time. But by France in the 1960s, just back in the time of the French Revolution. So the nexus between a revolt that's basically coming out of the university, inflamed by the ideas, the passions, the hopes, the aspirations, the trauma, the circumstances of this new elite who defined itself as anti-everything that preceded it. It's anti-family in the main. It's anti-capitalist. It's anti-colonialism. It's anti-traditional religion. It's anti. Very much like the young Marx. In some ways, the 1848ers in Germany, the neo-Hegelians, are really the great-grandparents or great-grandparents of this group. So this group in 20 years' time will be working in the institutions on the basis of the ideas that have been formed. Of course, to more or less, some have dropped those ideas, but a number keep those ideas, and it's been almost 2 generations since this event now. Over 1.5 or so generations, we can see the circulatory influence of that generation's understanding of reality, conforming with, fitting with the power that it has as the professional classes that modulate politics and social reproduction. They go into the business schools. This is why, as I said, they can be in a corporation, or they can be a university lecturer, or they can work in a trade union, they can work in a political party. It's all being fed by the same process, and it's a very sociological phenomenon, for good or ill. And one of the things I say constantly throughout this course is every solution, and there's lots of solutions that this generation come up with. I said they define themselves against. But for example, it was the way in which single mothers were treated and ostracized. You could see why people would hate that. And why? Especially as it begins to happen more, and there's a sexual revolution, you start to see that the sympathies gravitate towards certain issues. So they gravitate towards having an abortion, or someone who had an abortion, or someone who raised a single child. So the whole sympathetic substructure of the society becomes rejigged or reconfigured. So that's what is happening with this generation. And then as it comes to power, that's why we have the standoff we have today around ideas and groups. Those that have basically been more exposed through the professional reproductive process of the society, through the education system, through the newspapers they read, the news they read, listen to on the radio, etc., through those kind of narrative formers and circulators, and those that are more outside of that. It's often the more rural, less urban, lower classes, didn't get into university. They generally see the world in a very different way, and much more conservative and traditional way, in the main. Okay, anti-domination becomes the period, the big term. And if the term isn't used, you see the philosophy as they're doing. In Germany, you have the Frankfurt School, the cultural Marxists, I mentioned briefly. I won't go into them. In Germany also, a number of them end up in the US, but Jürgen Habermas as well. They would have an influence in the US and the UK as well. In the United States in 1971, I think I mentioned this before, John Rawls was the theory of justice. So comes up with the different principles, guaranteeing opportunities for the most disadvantaged. So it's a very egalitarian, narrative. Now you might note, and I'll come back, this was the point I raised about Marx, but it is worth repeating. No market economy can be equal by nature, because the market is a means for displaying what one wants by giving them enough of what you have or what you can afford to get what you want. So value in a market economy gravitates in a very uneven way. The more you can produce, the cheaper you can produce, the more you can produce what one wants, no matter what crap it is, no matter what, you know, you're making infantile TV shows and movies and games, blah, blah, it doesn't matter. In a market economy, you're going to become very rich by doing that. And someone who's doing something absolutely brilliant that everyone should love, I can't think what that might be, but you might be able to, you know, no one's going to pay you for, or very few people want to pay you for it. So that's the problem. So the only way you can change that, given that you have been trained in identifying, and you believe you have the capacity to do this, identifying what really matters, and you know through your education that it's not money, it's not profit, then you need to use institutions at your disposal to the extent that you have to go through all these loops to get in there, and then you can try and use the institution to become more equal. And to put this bluntly, it's not surprising that the intelligentsia, whose chief place of employment is going to be the university, would want a more egalitarian society so that they could be better paid by doing what they're doing. So note this, yes, of course, I'm putting an economic motivation into the picture. I'm not saying it's the only motivation, but we cannot take it out of the picture. And this where Marx was really onto something. As I said, it's such a pity he went all ideological on us. But other sociologists develop this and they don't fall prey to that. Okay. Now, it's the French post-structuralists I'm going to talk about for the next half an hour or so. I won't go too long. I don't think I need to. Their names, became celebrated from the late 1960s, 1970s. In France, it was very interesting that although they were kind of celebrities in France, and France has a culture of parading its intellectuals and putting them on various TV shows and in magazines and everything. They weren't the people that really dominated the teaching of ideas in university. It was still very traditionalist education if you were a philosophy student in France, for example. But these were the big names in the popular culture, and they would spread to the United States initially. And what happens is they tend to take on, or no, let me re-say that. In the United States, the enthusiastic readers of them tend to filter out the things that fit the United States demand for policy and legislative objectives, much more so than in France. In the main, all of these thinkers in France, they don't really come up with stuff that you could use in policy. And they're much more anarchic, is the word I would use. They're making the critique, they're trying to change the culture, but it's not really being used for kind of institutional leverage. In fact, if anything, I would say the difference between the United States intellectuals that use this group and the French themselves is that in the main, the French, in France, it's much more anti-institutional and didn't have the institutional impact and never had the institutional impact. I'm not saying it's got no impact, but doesn't have that it does in the US. In the US, it absolutely, the presence of these thinkers plus the Frankfurt School and some others absolutely becomes important in the teaching of the humanities and then what kind of books publishers publish in the humanities. If you look at the kind of books that were coming out of Harvard University Press, Yale, any of the North American university presses, the kind of area studies that they have, you compare that with 1950s, 1960s, you'll see there's no resemblance. There's still a bit of history, but apart from history, there's almost nothing else. It's changed so drastically. Whether for better or for worse is another thing. So basically, there's this group, there's a network of thinkers. They squabble amongst each other. They don't all agree on things, but they do have some things in common. And I would say generally, this lot, I'm not saying there weren't other intellectuals that didn't fit, but these were the ones that had most global impact in the United States, in the United Kingdom, and in Australia. The UK was slower to embrace these thinkers. Australia embraced them pretty quickly. We were more like the US. They cut across a range of disciplines. They, for example, Jacques Lacan was a psychoanalyst. Claude Lévi-Strauss was an anthropologist. A number were, Julia Kristeva was into structural linguistics and literary theory. It turned out she was a Romanian spy. Jacques Derrida, it took him forever to get his PhD, even when he had a big bundle of books, and people were saying he was an absolute genius. But he was at the interface between literary theory and philosophy. Michel Foucault was kind of looking at the history of institutions and philosophy. Gilles Deleuze, primarily philosophy, but also became big in film theory, working very often in tandem with Felix Guattari, who was a psychoanalyst, so that all gets mushed in there. Emmanuel Levinas was kind of the odd person out in the 1960s and 70s. He had been writing much earlier. He was a kind of anti-Heideggerian phenomenologist, is how I'd put this. But he was basically saw ethics as the basis of philosophy. And he was a big influence. Well, initially, Jacques Derrida writes a very strong critique of him. I can't remember if I talked about this last week. I did in one class. He writes a strong critique of Levinas. And then as Heidegger gets resurrected only to be beaten up for his fascism in work that broke out and information that came out in the 1980s, late 1980s, and because of Derrida's very heavy reliance upon Heidegger, Derrida goes from someone who writes a critique of Levinas using Heidegger in an essay called Violence and the Sacred, something like that, or is it Violence and the Metaphysics of the Sacred, something along those lines. Then he allies himself increasingly so with Levinas, and they have a love fest, and all his work starts to kind of look more and more like Levinas, which is basically, Levinas is, I find Levinas an absolutely unconvincing philosophy. It's kind of rhapsode about ethics, and people who love it, love it. But they basically are recognizing things that they believe. It's not something that's argued for or it's compelling in any way. He argues that ethics is the fundamental foundational relationship of everything, and that precedes ontology, that precedes any kind of being, so it's our relationships that are all important. I have no problem with that. And it's the face of the other that serves as the ethical basis. That's where I have the problem. I'm giving a very shorthand summary, but it is, he's got all sorts of claims about the nature of war and human relationships, which I think are completely unhistorical, absolutely fabricated, and totally worthless. Okay. If you like him, you can like him. Jean-Francois Lyotard, Report of the Postmodern Condition. This will be a big, widely read work. And so these thinkers in the 1990s, this bunch will all be lumped together by some people as postmodernists. And it's true that I'll tell you what that's about in a moment, but I'll just say it's true that in the main, these thinkers do share a lot in common. But the word postmodernist really only came into vogue in the 90s, and publishers couldn't fall over themselves quickly enough. Journalists were banding around the term. It was everywhere. And now you still see it occasionally, you know, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, postmodernist. Not very impressive. Jean Baudrillard, quite an interesting character. Sociologist, he began as a Marxist. Most of these began as Marxists. And then they defined themselves to various degrees within and against Marx. But ultimately, their emancipation objective, their anti-domination objective, keeps them very much in this camp. I might come back to some of this. I'll just well, the point here is some of them are doing literary theory, Marxist political theory, literary theory, you know, Baudrillard is really sociology and media. So they're across a gamut of things. But you notice, with the exception of Foucault, they're not doing history, not serious history. They're not doing political science. Again, Foucault is closest to this, but he only ever goes into the problem to solve his own, goes into the area with a prefabricated problem. He's not really a student of ancient society, for example. When he does look at medieval history, for example, he's interested in the confessional. So very limited parameters, because in his work on sex. Okay, here's some of the keys that, let's just call this the post-structuralist. In fact, a lot of these thinkers had considered themselves structuralists. And the idea, I don't want to overly complicate it, but the idea was that the understanding of anything operated on a basis of there was a kind of system or code. And that code could be looked at in terms of its formation, and that formation was a structural formation, and therefore you could see how power operated within this formation, and the code reflected this. So it was basically about power. So in 1966, in the United States, René Girard, who's not a post-structuralist, he became a big name in literary theory, especially with his work on the sacred, violence and the sacred. That may, I think It might be that Derrida, I should have it here, but I don't have it to hand. It might be the metaphysics of violence, and I'm thinking of violence in the sacred exactly. René Girard's work. Okay, so Girard and a couple of other people at a university in the United States say, let's get all these hotshot structuralists to come along and do a presentation and, you know, instruct us about how we can better do literature theory. So they were interested in philosophy being used for their literary classes. And basically, they were, and bluntly, but this is the case, they were basically a young group wanting a project inspired by these French philosophers and defining themselves against the older professors who were teaching literature in a way that they didn't think was political enough or social enough. So they drew in a number of people. Lacan went there. I think Deleuze went there. But a bunch of those people, not all of them that I had on the other page, and Jacques Derrida went there. So it was meant to be a seminar on structuralism. It was at Johns Hopkins University. And Derrida gives a paper in which he basically equates structuralism with the old philosophy, and the new big thing is post-structuralism or anti-structuralism. Now, the irony of this is that although it's called Writing Indifference, the essay, it's and it's a kind of it's a very youthful work. He's in his mid-30s, highly ambitious, makes all these big claims about the whole tradition, as if he knows everything. This is a problem I have with these guys. That they knew everything at a very young age, and they never did not know everything. Even Foucault complains about Derrida in that way, thinking he was a bit of a know-all. Anyway, so he does this paper in which he basically says all previous philosophy is built upon the idea of a domination strategy in which there are some elements that dominate, and what we can do is see that actually the way reading and writing work is that the elements are in free play, and they therefore deconstruct, is a word you'd later use, destabilize the totality. And this, and people went apeshit, they loved this, because ultimately it wasn't really different from what the structuralists were wanting to do, because they wanted to expose an imbalance of power in the structures of things. And all Derrida was doing, and that's why Deleuze called this whole bunch just shortly before this, had said we're all structuralists now. This is what structuralism is. And again, there's various little bits of infighting between them, but what they all end up agreeing is the idea that totality is domination, and that totality is oppressive. And therefore, you're looking for the minor elements. Now, you can see immediately, you can relate this. Humanity is an oppressive concept, but women or a minority identity is an emancipatory. And this, within the society itself, and we can go from reading to society. So it's basically reading out of reading into social participation, the same process of destabilization inherent within any totality. So this also then links up with their deployment of Nietzsche. Nietzsche claimed God is dead, and they then carry on and say, Nietzsche is saying there's really no subject. It's not just about God, it's about any kind of subject imposing themselves. So it's against all imposition. So ultimately, this brings up this idea of the death of the author. Roland Barthes uses that. What is an author? Asked Michel Foucault. And at the end of the day, an author is nothing but the crisscross of ideological currents, the structures, if I used to use the structuralist language, that they're enmeshed within. That's what they are. So basically, you, as the post-structuralist, as the seeker of emancipation, can see the alignments of oppression operating within a text and within a society, because you move from text to society. Society is just like a text. Derrida once famously said, there's nothing outside the text. And in a sense, the society and the text is the kind of, and the word, everything became inscribed. That became a very commonplace word, where it's socially inscribed. So in order to move outside of the oppressive formations of the society, you find the destabilization elements of resistance. So it becomes a strategy of resisting oppression, and that's as much in, if a text has stable meaning, if everyone is reading a text traditionally and you can read it more radically, that's an emancipatory act. Just as women breaking out of their traditional role in the household is an emancipatory act. It's all built around an analogy. But the subject, everything, Foucault will use the term, and this is one of his better ideas, is that it's not the objects that matter in the world, it's the discursive regimes that gravitate around the objects, and objects then become manufactured, in a sense, by a profession in order to justify its existence. Oh, I wish he stayed with that and done more with it. That's exactly what I think. I think he's totally right. But again, he gets caught up, as does Marx, in his own political issues, and therefore he only uses that up to a point. He fails to see how he himself could have been marshaled into the same process, which he is. This is also why there's a whole lot of philosophers accuse all the post-structuralists of being relativists. So they read this as a kind of metaphysics and ontology. And in the main, what this lot are doing is much more, some of them end up doing straight philosophy, ontology, some developments in that direction, but in the main, it's much more a socio-historical literary account. Ultimately, I think calling them relativists doesn't really happen. And in fact, the people that are usually calling them relativists, I think fail to grasp that this lot is very absolutist. And their absolute is emancipation. The problem is it doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean anything more than Marx had it mean. It doesn't mean anything more than what Gonzalo said, and I quoted that from it's vacuous. It's really vacuous. This is the problem. It ultimately enables one group to criticize another group, but to ring fence himself by criticism, by concealing their own discursive regime, their own operations of interest. And in this sense, I think it's very cool elite behavior. I think it's very, and I think you could go back and a completely different group. I think the professionals operating around the French Revolution, I think they screened off their own interest by referring to the people, but it wasn't the people, as you might recall, I think I mentioned in this class. When it came to having a vote, a plebiscite, on what was essentially the Constitution, the Constitution of 1793-94, most of the population just abstained from voting. They didn't care about it. Didn't touch them. The people weren't touched by what those claiming to think on their behalf thought. It's a very similar thing. There's also, I mean, all these things, you know, as I said, each of them accentuates a bit. Baudrillard pushes everything sociologically. He argues there's no longer any original from which we make copies. There's a desert, he calls it desert of the real. And it's great terms and work, simulacra and simulation, writes a whole ton of books, but seduction and irony. And basically, possibly of all, I do like Baudrillard. I think he's very funny, he's very witty. Again, very limited, but he is the most ironic. He ultimately ends up less being the know-all with the solution. He's just seeing a madhouse. And he has a great formulation. The philosopher Leibniz has been said, you know, his problem was, why is there something rather than nothing? And Baudrillard, looking at the modern world, says, why is there always nothing rather than something? You know, it's like everything's fake. So I've got a certain attraction to that. And also this tends to be an attraction towards seeing the world in very Kafkaesque, the great writer Franz Kafka, you know, as a kind of bad dream from which we wish to awake. And that's basically, Foucault sees normalness and all our institutions as kind of nightmarish. But again, what's very interesting, I'll give you a good anecdote to grasp this, is the irony of this. So Foucault's writings in the 1960s are highly critical of the professional classes and their grab for power. This is where he's more Nietzschean than Marxian. He basically thinks Nietzsche's right that every group is struggling for power. Okay. But he doesn't like the psychiatrists, he doesn't like the social workers, because they use their power to take the more interesting people. And at this stage, people like Foucault, and there are a number of others, and they're a bit of a movement, social movement, that didn't last that long because things kept going wrong. That is to release prisoners, siding with prisoners. The prisoners were kind of the new proletariat. They were the most oppressed, and Foucault was basically saying there shouldn't be any prisons. He tries to wriggle out of this, but in Discipline and Punishment, that's basically the inference that everybody will get. Well, good luck to that. No prisons, eh? Okay, take them home, bring them home. Let them live with you. Terrific. Love, great. Okay, so sorry about the irony, but you know, it's hard to believe these ideas could be taken seriously. But anyway, so he's really anti the social workers, and a group of social workers approached me because they'd known I'd spent a lot of time reading Foucault. And they asked if I'd conduct a reading group because they wanted to use Foucault for their social work practice. And in fact, there was also the Family Therapy Journal of Family Therapy, which was a very close friend of mine used to get that journal, and I would look at it, and eventually it went from having different gurus, and then Foucault came along. He was the guru of the journal. It was, you saw before your very eyes something quickly turning into its opposite. This is the way the world works, by the way. Again, you know that if you study revolutions. The out group become the in group. The people that were jailed now jail other people. You know, on and on it goes. So every idea, the subject, and this is a famous quote of Gilles Deleuze, man did not survive God, nor did the identity of the subject survive that of substance. Look, the reason they're saying this is because they basically see the world in very voluntaristic, very plastic terms. We can make of the world what we want. We don't have to be whole to that tradition. And the tradition is oppressive. It's what I said, it's fascistic in its inception. This is how they see it. I'm just going to run through some other key ideas for the next two slides. I want to finish in 20 minutes or so. First of all, the contingent, the negative, the marginal, you know, they take priority over system, law, rule. And this of itself is not necessarily wrong-headed. What I think the problem is that they're not consistent enough with doing this because they've already put it into binary. I mean, Derrida is famous for being opposed to binaries, but what is totality, anti-totality? Emancipation, domination. What are these but binaries? They're absolutely working with a binary, and they've absolutized this because they've absolutized emancipation. And this is really a problem. If you go back and you think of all the other philosophers we've looked at, you can't explain Plato or Aristotle his concerns by providing this kind of, you can't understand what the virtues are for him by this. Emancipation is not a virtue for the ancients like that. And even the way freedom is used, liberality is used in Aristotle, is not like this. This is on the one hand, it's a, and it changes over time. On the one hand, it's this, the second point, this infinite play of the passions, infinite openness. What opposes difference is jouissance. That comes from Lacan, the psychoanalyst, that he was really pissed off. That he thought Derrida had just stolen his concept of jouissance. They're all very vain as well. You read their biographies. If you like vanity and idolatry, you'll love it. But, you know, it doesn't shake my boat. If I want idols, I'll go and look at Guitar Heroes. They're much more compelling. Chet Atkins, Tommy Emmanuel. Okay, I'm amusing myself. Maybe no one else. So he sees this idea of difference, a constant deferring of stability, a deference of meaning. This is all part of this jostle and bustle. But it's also, as in Lacan, it's also symptomized of a kind of emotional responsiveness to the world, a kind of, well, I said irony in the case of Baudrillard, but this playfulness. And Derrida's work, I find it tedious, but it's very playful. It's constantly playing. It's constantly, it reminds me of a 3-year-old trapping you in a room, showing you their magic tricks that they've just learned, and I just want to climb out the window. That's what reading Derrida is like for me. A lot of it I can't bear. It's so clever. It's so clever, but clever in, I think, this infantile way of displaying the cleverness in look at the margin, and look where the word is, and look how this element is shifting around, blah, blah, blah. Okay. It's inherently unstable. It uses Ferdinand Saussure's idea of linguistics as a kind of counter, as a negation. Every totality is unraveled, as I said, by its own elements. So that's why it's anti-structural linguistics, the ability. But we in a system, we should, you know, we should be free, we should be playful. In a way, it captures that spirit of what all these young people were doing in the 60s. So he's putting this in a kind of more theoretical book-like form. One of his other famous ideas is the poison, the pharmacon, which Plato talks about in the Phaedrus. Phaedrus or Phaedo? No, it's the Phaedo. The dialogue with Socrates confronting death. And the word, the cure and the poison, one and the same thing. Again, this gets taken up and enthusiastic. He uses the terms of decentering, the presence of absence, dismantling of stable meanings. And yet I just keep coming back to the fact that underneath it all, very visible, the dominators and dominated. It doesn't really, it only does this to a certain purpose. And eventually, Derrida ends up, as I said, he sides with Levinas. When he's doing this, he's not with Levinas. He sides with Levinas and he ends up saying, everything is about justice. And the reading that I've given you a reference to and a link to, if you read that chapter, you'll see him banging on and on about justice. And it's basically, again, it's a view of alignment of the disinherited, the more marginalized groups, so to speak, so they could get this thing called justice. And I think that just leaves so much philosophically out of the picture. Yeah, he's very clever. He's very clever. Lacan I find very interesting. He's he's a complete wag. And not a great example of psychiatric ethics, if anyone wants to look that up. But he's very clever. But he's a psychiatrist, you see, a psychoanalyst. He's not a philosopher. Derrida is somewhere between literature and philosophy. The philosopher's coming out of the more analytic tradition, as it's called, the more mainstream tradition in the United Kingdom and the United States. They hated him. Now, I have a very different set of issues with Derrida than they do. And at Cambridge, he was supposed to get a doctorate. A whole bunch of very prestigious philosophers all teamed up to attack Derrida. Now, he wrote a very good response, because I think a lot of what they said was rubbish. And I think his response to them is it's smart. And in fact, I don't think I think they've got their own burdens. And that's because one of the things I hope I've conveyed to you through this course is philosophy is not the golden key to reality. Reality is a great mystery and has all sorts of vistas, and philosophy is full of contestating optics. It opens up a certain vista, but there's other things that it's not going to help you very much with. Okay, I'll just mention, Derrida does write on Walter Benjamin. He was very important, and over time, a lot of people who like post-structuralists tend to like Walter Benjamin. He's more closer to the Frankfurt School coming out of Germany. By the by, it's only in the 1980s, the French start to become more aware of the Germans. It's happening in the 1980s. A bit before the late 1980s, because Foucault dies in the early-ish to mid-ish 1980s, dies of AIDS. He couldn't understand why someone like Habermas was so hostile to him. Derrida couldn't understand it either. Then eventually Derrida and Habermas become good friends, kiss and make up, so to speak. And that's partly because the whole philosophy has moved from this more anarchic to more ethical position. And Walter Benjamin, why he's important is this idea of the tradition of the oppressed teaches us that the state of emergency in which we live is not the exception but the rule. And basically, he sees himself as a Marxist working upon culture, but he wants to basically he wants people to be aware of the people that have been written out of history, the marginal, the crushed, the oppressed. Again, it's this anti-domination thing. And he's looking for political alliances that will ultimately overthrow the system. And this is the problem. This is where I get to the problem. It's not because these people are arresting the social subgroups. It's the way in which they oversimplify the nature of the economy and social reproduction and classes to do that. And in fact, what ends up happening, of course, is nothing like what they want. The system doesn't get overthrown. The system just becomes something redefined by an elite who focus upon certain groups and certain issues rather than other groups and other issues. But it doesn't deliver the great emancipation that is promised. There's also Jean-Francois Lyotard. He defines postmodernism as the incredulity towards meta-narratives. So no big stories, but of course, what is this but a big story? Again, society consists of, he takes up this idea of Ludwig Wittgenstein, a numeral language game. Each has its own criteria of legitimacy. He says it's not truth or reason, but what he calls parology, There's new games of reasoning. So again, you can see why traditional philosophers hate it. On the other hand, it's all about creative play. On the other hand, it's another variant on any attempt to have a systemic set of rules overlay which imprison, so to speak, the subject. Which subjects the subject to something oppressive. This is all about throwing all that off. And this is, again, any rule and what goes against it. It's all such a variant. Again, I tend to his day came and went much quicker than Derrida. Derrida and Foucault and Deleuze and Levinas, of the names I've mentioned, are probably the most enduring. The best philosophically is without a doubt Deleuze. Deleuze is, he writes some great, I was very critical of what he says about Nietzsche. But ultimately, I think he presents a version of Nietzsche which makes of these professionals the new Supermen and Hiremen. That's what I think he does. And that's what I think is happening with the deployment of Nietzsche. Is that you can join Nietzsche and Marx together by basically presenting yourself, defending the herd, the mass, at the same time you yourself see yourself as a higher person, a higher man, ready for the Superman, or higher woman, etc. But Deleuze is the most schooled in the history of philosophy. He has a number of books on philosophy. He hates Hegel with a passion. I won't go into that. I think his reading of Hegel is not very good. He's always very inventive, but it's always working towards this idea of difference. If there's one central idea but you can see what I've said about deconstruction, what I'm saying about Lyotard. You know, they're all circling around the same fire or same wagon or whatever, sets of wagons. The real by its nature is outside of identity. There is no identity, totality. It's the difference, not the identity, that is involved in repetition. I spoke critically of how he speaks about Nietzsche's eternal regret, because basically he maps on this phrase of Nietzsche's, and in his hands nothing's left but the phrase, to explain what he calls the infinite repetition, which is an eternal return, but always with a difference, which is very different to Nietzsche. I could also mention, you know, Lyotard going back there. He calls the different. So we got the different, difference, the different, something that cannot be included under the rule, an existent which acts in negation. You can see all variations on the same thing. Lyotard talking about narrative and society in a kind of sociological way. Deleuze talking more ontologically. Lyotard also goes on about the sublime in Kant, the presenting of something unpresentable, the presence of absence in Derrida. It's very frustrating because, you know, so much ink has been spilt on this stuff as if this is the greatest generation of thinkers that have ever existed. And they're not. They're just not. They are what they are. They're working with a set of problems. They're trying to wrestle themselves out of what they see as a stultifying society. They want to break against any kind of rules, but at the end of the day, as soon as their ideas become institutionalized, it becomes another narrative set of institutional capture and entrapment. You can read this about answering the question, what is postmodern? It's a variation on everything I say. I feel I'm really repeating myself. And that's how I feel when I read them. I feel I'm not learning anything new. I'm just going through a certain dance. Of course, if your professional career is built upon all the variegations of distinction, the difference, the different, all of that. And you don't bother questioning the whole issue about emancipation and domination. That's something that you don't even talk about, because it's so obvious that we're dominating, that we're dominated, sorry. And we, the intelligentsia, are freeing you from that domination. It's so obvious. If you think that, you like it. I don't think that. I don't think people ever know what they're doing. Okay. Finally, political ideas today. I'm going to sum up the course. The West is in a very deep crisis. I've alluded to this throughout. What happened with the generation of the 60s was really the beginning of a deep rupture, a deep crisis within the West that is being played out. It's being played out in the ballot box. It's being played out with different groups. It's being played out in the politics of the age. It's being played out in terms of global capital versus national capital. And it's being played out in an arena where all sorts of other contestations, divisions, potential wars are in operation, geopolitical. What are we seeing? The end or a fusion of liberalism, communism, socialism, fascism, 68. I tend to think that every reality, the nomenclature for it, is always backdated. It's always out of date, like in the cans of food you eat. And you don't know what you're doing because you're using words that don't help very much. And when you have a traditional society where one of the things about traditional society is you're trying to ward off change. You're trying to keep the ancestral trail of spirits alive. They've been to the future. You're being guided by them. Our modern world is exactly the opposite. I remember a famous literary theorist, a literary theorist work, John, his name will come back in a moment. But he's one of the earliest structuralists in Great Britain writing on literature. And it was an introductory text on Jonathan. He writes on Baudelaire. Well, I'm not going to find it. I'll just see. Just 1 second. Jonathan. I won't find it. Anyway, I won't look. It's driving me crazy. He had a brief moment in the sun in literary theory. He's quite well known in literature study. And at one stage, he's talking about this new structuralism and what's going on. So it's before the structuralism, post-structuralism. And he says, he likens this position, in which he includes Heidegger, he says Heidegger is an important player in this, to people cutting off the branch they're sitting on. But he doesn't make this as a criticism. He's saying that's because they see the tree is so rotten, essentially, that the fall has to end up somewhere better. And I think that's a very powerful image. Jonathan Culler is his name. Culler. I knew it would come back to me. I think that's a really good image, because basically what you've got is the elites now moving into a future which they hope will conform to their view of the world. But of course they've got what you haven't factored in, what you don't know, is reaction, response. And human beings are responsive creatures. And this is where the conflicts and commonalities are so up in the air today, that these ideas will not last forever. It's not like this bunch came along and this is it. Not at all. Moreover, the geopolitical contestations that now confront us. The Middle East is still, I think, the biggest one, but China's rise, big issue, brought very into more prominence, of course, by the coronavirus. Now that looks to be the frontline issue, but I think over time, over the last 2 generations, the Middle Eastern conflicts and the rise of Islamism, which spills out of the Middle East, but not purely contained, restricted to the Middle East. It goes right up to Central Asia, into China, the conflicts going on in Western Europe, anti-immigration parties, Islamist groups in Western Europe. This is a massive set of problems, and the kind of thinking that this last group come up with is it's not forged for that kind of problem. And as the West is caught up in its own civil war, I have hope that in doing this course you will have learned something of the complexity of the tradition, historical, institutional, ideational, theoretical, and that you are able to use this in your other studies. And I wish you all the best with everything you do. And thank you for having done this course. I wish you best of luck with your grades and your work. Bye.